The gavel cracked like thunder as the courtroom held its breath, and Maya Brooks said, "If this is justice, why does it taste like ash?" Daniel Hart squeezed her shoulder and said, "We can appeal, we always can." Judge words still floated like smoke, and Lex Turner said, "You are all missing what I found." Jonah Reed stood at the aisle and said, "Stand down, kid, chain of custody matters." Reporters swarmed like gulls, and Evelyn Sloan said, "Order will be restored, or contempt will be swift." The verdict favored the city, and Maya's sealed letter burned a hole in her pocket like a live coal. A phone buzzed on silent, and Daniel said, "Do not answer, not yet." The clerk coughed, the doors groaned, and Lex said, "The file proves someone paid for silence." Jonah's eyes flickered and he said, "Evidence appears when it wants to be seen." Somewhere beyond the oak panels, a melody drifted like a ghost. The corridor smelled of wet wool and old paper as Maya steadied herself against the wall. And Daniel said, "Breathe. 1 count in, 2 counts out." Lex started ahead with the swagger of a spark, and he said, "You need to see the transfer logs." Jonah matched their pace with an easy calm and said, "No one sees anything outside protocol." Evelyn's cane tapped once on tile without needing support, and she said, "Counsel, control your witnesses." The rain hammered the skylight like a metronome for panic, and Maya said someone bought that verdict. A ringtone purred again, unknown number, and Daniel said, "Let it go to whatever void it wants." Lex pulled a crumpled printout like a magician and he said, "Look who signed the chain." Jonah's eyes cooled like riverstone and he said, "You do not understand what you are inviting." The skylight dimmed as storm clouds muscled closer. They crowded by a vending machine humming like a tired engine, and Lex said, "The payment trail hits a consultancy with no office." Daniel scanned the page with care and said, "Routing shuffles, names scrubbed, classic wash." Jonah stepped between Lex and Maya with quiet certainty and said, "This is inadmissible without provenance." Maya kept the envelope sealed, and she said, "Someone wanted Rose erased, and this smells like the same hand." The phone vibrated again in her pocket, and Evelyn said, "Some ghosts dial when they want attention." Daniel's eyes warmed, then sharpened, and he said, "We do not chase phantoms, we map patterns." Lex's grin faded into grit, and he said, "Then map me because I was there when the file vanished." Jonah's jaw set like iron, and he said, "Enough confessions in hallways." Rain boomed overhead. They moved toward a stairwell that coughed echoes, and Maya said, "Why did you come, Lex?" Lex skipped 3 steps like a dare and said, "Because you keep missing the pattern." Daniel smoothed his tie as if ironing thoughts and said, "Patterns require anchors, not rumors." Jonah tested the stair rail with habit, and he said, "Safety first, even for truth." From below, a janitor's radio muttered static, and Evelyn said, "Truth is a suit tailored by whoever pays." Maya pressed the envelope harder, and she said, "Rose wanted me to read this after the verdict." The storm cut the power for a heartbeat, and darkness grabbed the breathing. Daniel counted softly, and he said, 1, 2, back again." The lights returned with a blink, and Lex said, "Then open it." Maya broke the wax with a snap that felt louder than thunder, and Daniel said, "We do this together." The paper crackled like dry leaves, and Lex said, "Read it out." Jonah shifted his weight as if bracing a door, and he said, "Think before speaking what cannot be unsaid." The letter's ink bled slightly from years, and Maya said, "She wrote about a woman who collected favors like rings." Evelyn's smile was small and patient, and she said, "Names are brittle when spoken carelessly." The hallway fell into a hush that pressed the lungs, and Daniel said, "Keep going." Maya steadied her hands and said, "She warned me that the architect wears kindness like velvet." Lex exhaled a wordless curse, and Jonah stared at the floor, where rain tracked patterns like veins. The diner's neon buzzed against the rain-slicked windows as Maya stirred untouched coffee, and she said, "Every answer costs me more than I can pay." Daniel leaned forward with steady calm and said, "That's why I'm here, to carry what you can't." Lex flipped a coin across the table like a restless signal and said, "Ghosts don't pay bills, but their shadows sure do." Jonah stood near the counter, body like a wall, and he said, "Stop letting him provoke you." Evelyn arrived late, slipping into the booth like silk, and she said, "Comfort is a currency we all spend." The jukebox coughed a forgotten tune, and Maya said, "I don't need comfort, I need truth." Daniel's jaw tightened, but his tone soothed as he said, "We'll get both, step by step." Lex smirked, but eyes betrayed hunger, and he said, "Then let me light the match." Maya pushed the letter across the table, her hand trembling despite the strong grip she tried to hold, and she said, "Rose trusted me, and I never read it." Daniel pressed the edge flat with his palm, and he said, "Trust doesn't vanish because time passes." Lex leaned closer, eyes sharp, and said, "What if she trusted the wrong one?" Jonah shot him a glare colder than steel, and said, "You're speaking to someone carrying graves on her back." Evelyn stirred sugar into tea without tasting, and she said, "Some burdens need to be shared to lose their weight." Maya glanced at her reflection in the window distorted by rain, and she said, "But what if sharing makes the weight fatal?" Daniel's voice dropped low, soft as a prayer, and he said, "Then I'll hold it with you." The storm rattled the diner's sign like a warning bell. Lex slammed his palm against the table, rattling cups, and he said, "You keep acting like the past won't burn you." Maya kept her eyes on the sealed envelope, now cracked, and she said, "It already has." Daniel's hand hovered near hers with a quiet gravity, and he said, "The fire doesn't choose its victims." Jonah's voice steadied the space as he said, "But it chooses who survives." Evelyn's smile curled with patience, and she said, "Survivors owe their survival a debt." Lex snorted bitterly and said, "Debt paid with silence or blood." Maya inhaled deeply, and she said, "Rose was only 17 when she vanished." Daniel's throat tightened, and he said, "And yet her echo still drives this room." Thunder cracked outside as if echoing her pain. The waitress dropped the check with a weary nod, and Maya said, "Even strangers can see the cracks." Daniel slipped cash into the folder with deliberate calm, and he said, "Cracks let light in, they don't only break." Lex pocketed his sketchbook with a snap, and he said, "Depends what crawls through the cracks." Jonah stood at the door scanning the street, and he said, "Eyes on the outside, we don't know who's listening." Evelyn dabbed her lips with a linen napkin like a performance, and she said, "Everything worth hearing is already paid for." Maya felt the storm's wind push against the doorframe, and she said, "Every path I walk feels already mapped by someone else." Daniel held the door open for her, and he said, "Then we redraw the map tonight." Lightning lit the parking lot in a sudden glare. They huddled under a street lamp buzzing against the storm, and Maya said, "I don't even know who to trust anymore." Daniel placed his coat over her shoulders, and he said, "Start with the ones still standing beside you." Lex kicked at a puddle, restless, and he said, "I stand here, but that doesn't make me safe." Jonah adjusted his tie, watching shadows shift, and he said, "Safety is a lie we use to sleep at night." Evelyn clasped her umbrella with elegance, and she said, "Trust is earned, not granted." Maya gripped the letter tightly, and she said, "Then Rose's words will decide who deserves mine." Daniel's eyes softened but carried steel, and he said, "Then let's listen carefully, because echoes never lie." Thunder swallowed their voices as headlights approached slowly down the slick street. The archive room hummed with the sound of failing fluorescent lights, and Maya said, "If truth hides anywhere, it hides here." Daniel dusted an old ledger with care, and he said, "Every line written tells more than its author intended." Lex balanced on the edge of a chair with restless energy, and he said, "The missing pages mean more than the ones left." Jonah held the door with a steady grip, and he said, "Keep your voice down, security won't look kindly on us." Evelyn trailed her fingers across polished cabinets, and she said, "Secrets don't disappear, they only migrate." Maya's pulse quickened at the sight of Rose's name, and she said, "Her name was erased, but the ink left scars." Daniel's face stiffened as he said, "And scars are harder to hide than wounds." The air smelled of mildew and dust, suffocating the breath between them. Maya traced the blank section in the record book, and she said, "They carved her name out like she never breathed." Daniel leaned closer, whispering low, and he said, "But erasure leaves shadows." Lex waved a flashlight across a wall of boxes, and he said, "Shadows can scream louder than words." Jonah crossed his arms, standing like a sentry, and he said, "Or they can lure you into traps." Evelyn's eyes gleamed as she said, "Fear of shadows gives them power." The building groaned under the weight of the storm, and Maya said, "I can't carry her absence alone." Daniel touched her shoulder gently and he said, "You won't." Lex smirked as if carrying a spark, and he said, "Then follow the missing pages, not the ones you're handed." The flashlight caught a hidden drawer and Lex said, "See, truth leaves fingerprints." Maya pulled at the handle with trembling force and she said, "If this opens, we may regret it." Daniel steadied the drawer with a calm grip, and he said, "Regret is easier than ignorance." Jonah's eyes sharpened as he said, "Not if it costs us everything." Evelyn stepped closer like a shadow blending into the dark, and she said, "Sometimes everything is the price." The drawer squeaked open to reveal letters stained with age, and Maya said, her handwriting unchanged, unbroken. Lex whispered with awe, "She never left." Daniel's jaw clenched tight as he said, "Then someone buried her truth alive." The storm rumbled, as if agreeing with the revelation. Maya read aloud trembling words, and she said, "Rose feared a velvet hand guiding every silence." Daniel leaned forward, eyes narrowing, and he said, "Velvet hand, that's no metaphor." Lex snapped his fingers with sudden clarity, and he said, "It's her, the one who pays for silence." Jonah's expression hardened like stone, and he said, "Then naming her could break us all." Evelyn tilted her head with a serene smile, and she said, "Or it could prove who still holds control." The storm pounded against the building as if warning them back, and Maya said, "Rose trusted me to finish what she couldn't." Daniel spoke with calm iron, and he said, "Then we won't stop here." Lex tucked the letter into his jacket, whispering, "No fire dies unless fed." The sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway, and Jonah said, "We're not alone anymore." Maya pressed the letters against her chest and she said, "Then they'll have to take them from me." Daniel moved closer to shield her, and he said, "No one takes what's already bound to truth." Lex tightened his jaw, and he said, "Truth doesn't keep you safe, it paints a target." Evelyn smoothed her sleeve like nothing had shifted, and she said, "Then safety was never yours to claim." The door rattled as shadows loomed beyond the frosted glass, and Maya whispered, "We've crossed the point of return." Daniel's eyes fixed on the door with steel, and he said, "Then let them come." The lights flickered, and the storm swallowed the rest of the night in thunder. The storm dragged shadows across the courthouse basement as Maya pressed the recovered letters to her chest, and she said, "She named someone, I can feel it." Daniel steadied his breath and he said, "Then speak it before it vanishes again." Lex circled with restless pacing, and he said, "Velvet hand, velvet blade. Same thing." Jonah leaned against the iron door, his tone sharp, and he said, "Stop throwing guesses. Every word you waste puts us closer to chains." Evelyn clasped her hands gently, smile polished as marble, and she said, "Some names cut deeper than knives." Maya unfolded the last page trembling, and she said, "Rose wrote of someone close, a collector of silence." Daniel whispered, "A predator dressed as protector." Lex's voice cracked as he said, "Then we're staring at the hunter, not the prey." Thunder rolled as the air thickened with accusation. Maya's voice cracked as she read aloud, "She feared the velvet blade that smiled at every gathering." Daniel's eyes narrowed as he said, "It's not metaphor, it's a portrait." Lex snapped his gaze at Evelyn and he said, "Always perfect, always in control." Jonah's arms stiffened, his voice low, and he said, "Careful what you imply, boy." Evelyn tilted her head with calm elegance, and she said, "You think shadows define me, but I define shadows." Maya shivered, and she said, Rose wrote she felt watched by kindness turned to iron. Daniel leaned closer, and he said, a blade hidden in velvet. Lex's laugh was short and bitter as he said, then we've been dining with the executioner. Silence swallowed the basement, broken only by the storm. Lex stepped forward, fingers stabbing the air, and he said, she's the velvet blade. Jonah blocked him, jaw hard, and he said, accusations without proof ruin lives. Evelyn folded her arms like a queen at trial, and she said, proof is a matter of perspective. Maya's hands shook with the letter, and she said, Rose trusted me, and she named you. Daniel's throat tightened, voice low, and he said, if the name was written, then the burden is ours to carry. Lex's eyes burned with youth and fire, and he said, burden or not, the truth won't be silenced. Evelyn's smile did not waver, and she said, you mistake shadows for substance. Thunder cracked overhead as the bulbs swung violently. Maya slammed the letter against the table, and she said, Rose's words are ink, not illusion. Daniel steadied her wrist gently, and he said, ink fades, but intent survives. Lex pulled out his sketchbook, tossing it open, and he said, she wrote the same symbol I drew weeks ago. Jonah's brow furrowed as he said, symbols don't stand in court, evidence does. Evelyn leaned closer, voice velvet and sharp, and she said, symbols only matter if you believe in ghosts. Maya's voice hardened, and she said, Rose wasn't a ghost, she was my blood. Daniel's face tightened with pain, and he said, and her bloodstains more than paper now. The storm howled through cracked windows as the truth hovered unspoken. The basement door burst open with a metallic crash, and a guard's flashlight cut across them. Jonah stepped forward quickly, and he said, we were never here. Maya shoved the letters into her coat, and she said, Rose's voice will not die here. Daniel pulled Lex back, whispering, patience keeps us alive. Lex snarled but obeyed, and he said, patience feels like surrender. Evelyn glided past the guard with perfect calm, and she said, you saw nothing. You remembered nothing. The guard hesitated, confusion clouding his eyes. Maya whispered to herself, truth walks in velvet, but it bleeds like steel. The storm's echo grew louder, drowning out every heartbeat. The courtroom filled again under storm clouds pressing against the windows, and Maya said, if this trial breaks me, then let it break on truth. Daniel adjusted his tie firmly, and he said, truth stands only when we hold it steady. Lex sat restless in the gallery, and he said, they'll bury you the way they buried her. Jonah leaned close, voice steady as stone, and he said, you've carried heavier wounds. Evelyn glided into the defense table with calm power, and she said, justice bends to those who hold the strings. Maya tightened her grip on the letters, and she said, then I'll cut every string you weave. Daniel whispered without flinching, we are ready to burn what binds us. The jury shifted uncomfortably as the gavel struck to open the session. The prosecutor cleared his throat, but Maya rose first, and she said, these letters are testimony of a voice erased. Daniel handed the judge the sealed pages, and he said, history does not vanish when ink remains. Lex leaned forward from the gallery, whispering, say her name, make them hear it. Jonah shifted closer to her side, murmuring, names are blades sharper than steel. Evelyn folded her hands on the table, her smile unbroken, and she said, forged blades cut both wielder and foe. Maya's voice shook yet grew, and she said, Rose Brooks was stolen, and silence was bought. Daniel nodded firmly, and he said, her words are the wound that never healed. The gallery erupted with gasps as the jury scribbled furiously. The judge's gavel froze mid-air as Evelyn rose, and she said, these words are the ramblings of a girl lost to fantasy. Maya slammed her hand on the stand, and she said, her words bled before her body was taken. Daniel's voice steadied like iron, and he said, discrediting the dead does not erase the crime. Lex stood half risen from the bench, and he said, she lived in my drawings, every shadow true. Jonah stepped forward, tension like thunder, and he said, don't let this become theater. Evelyn's eyes gleamed, her tone silk, and she said, everything is theater when the stage is justice. Maya's face flushed as she said, "Then let this be her final act of defiance." The courtroom buzzed like a hive. The bailiff slammed his baton for order, but the letters lay on the judge's desk glowing under dim light, and Maya said, "Read her fear, see her warning." Daniel pressed forward, voice steady, and he said, "Her trust was betrayed by those who claimed protection." Lex shouted from the gallery and he said, "Stop letting them silence her again." Jonah grabbed his shoulder stern and said, "Control yourself, or you'll lose her voice again." Evelyn adjusted her sleeve with a smile, and she said, "A warning written in trembling hand holds no weight in law." Maya's eyes burned as she said, "But it carries the weight of truth." Daniel's voice deepened as he said, "And truth, even when hidden, cuts deeper than any blade." The jury shifted uneasily as thunder rattled the roof. The courtroom lights flickered as thunder roared, and Maya said, "Rose's ghost stands with me today." Daniel lifted the final page high and he said, "Her words are testimony that cannot be erased." Lex broke free of Jonah's grip, shouting, "This is her justice, not yours." Jonah caught him again, voice grave, and said, "Justice belongs to no one. It belongs to truth." Evelyn leaned against the defense table, her smile unwavering, and she said, "Truth is what the powerful decide it is." Maya's voice rose above the storm, and she said, "Not tonight." The judge finally struck the gavel with force, and he said, "This court will decide what justice means." The storm shook the courthouse as if demanding its own verdict. The gavel's echo still shook the walls when the jury filed out, and Maya whispered, "Whatever they decide, Rose still speaks tonight." Daniel placed a steadying hand on her shoulder, and he said, "Her words will not vanish, no matter the verdict." Lex slumped against the gallery bench, voice sharp, and he said, "Verdicts are ink, but ink fades." Jonah's voice rumbled, and he said, "Verdicts shape the chains we wear or break." Evelyn crossed her legs with practiced calm, and she said, "Verdicts shape reality, and reality bends to those who command it." Maya exhaled with trembling control, and she said, "Not this time. Her truth bends nothing. It breaks masks." Daniel's eyes softened but carried fire, and he said, "Then let us be ready to face what remains when masks fall." The hallway lights flickered as footsteps echoed, and Maya said, "Each sound feels like her returning." Daniel walked beside her steady and quiet, and he said, "She walks with you, not against you." Lex kicked a trash bin in frustration, and he said, "The world doesn't care about ghosts." Jonah steadied him with a hand on his shoulder, and he said, "It cares when the living speak their names loud enough." Evelyn's heels clicked like a metronome, and she said, "Names are currency, and you spend yours recklessly." Maya tightened her grip on the envelope, and she said, "Her name is the only wealth I carry." Daniel whispered with conviction, and he said, "Then carry it into fire, and let it burn away silence." They reached the marble lobby as the jury returned, faces grave. Maya's breath caught, and she said, "This is it." Daniel leaned close, firm as steel, and he said, "Stand tall, no matter the sound." Lex whispered with fire, and he said, "If they bury truth, I'll dig it out again." Jonah's jaw clenched tight, and he said, "Patience, boy. Fire consumes too quickly." Evelyn smiled faintly, and she said, "Verdicts do not reveal truth. They craft it." Maya's hands trembled, and she said, "Then let them craft their lies. I'll keep my truth alive." Daniel gave her a nod filled with silent loyalty, and he said, "Then no verdict can silence you." The thunder outside matched their heartbeats as the foreman cleared his throat. The foreman's words cracked like stone, "We find the defendant not guilty." Gasps erupted, and Maya's knees almost gave way as she said, "They freed the blade." Daniel caught her arm firmly, and he said, "Justice was bent, but not broken." Lex shouted in anger, and he said, "Not guilty means Rose dies again." Jonah gripped his shoulder tightly, voice low, and said, "Control the fire, or it consumes us all." Evelyn rose smoothly, smile sharp as glass, and she said, "Truth remains what power declares." Maya's eyes brimmed with grief and fury, And she said, then power has declared war on memory. Daniel whispered, we will carry that war forward, one truth at a time. The courtroom emptied under thunder's roar, leaving silence heavier than chains. Maya touched the photo of Rose on the wall and said, they denied you justice, but not your voice. Daniel stood beside her, eyes firm, and he said, voices live longer than verdicts. Lex stepped forward with clenched fists and he said, then let me carry her scream. Jonah's voice rumbled steady, and he said, carry it with care, not fire. Evelyn lingered at the doorway, smile fading into shadow, and she said, justice is always a story told by the winners. Maya turned, eyes burning, and she said, then I'll rewrite the story. The storm's echo carried her vow through the empty chamber. The courthouse steps glistened with rain as Maya descended slowly, and she said, they freed her killer-in-law but not in memory. Daniel held an umbrella over them and he said, memory is heavier than verdicts. Lex kicked at the puddles with restless anger, and he said, then let her ghost drown them. Jonah's steady voice cut through the storm and he said, ghosts don't drown, they remind us to breathe. Evelyn paused at the top step, eyes gleaming like polished stone, and she said, justice belongs to those who control the ending. Maya looked back up with fire in her eyes and she said, then the ending is still unwritten. Thunder rolled like a closing drum beat as the city lights flickered beyond. They stopped by the courthouse fountain where rain merged with its still waters. Maya touched the surface lightly and said, Rose's voice ripples in silence. Daniel's hand joined hers, steady, and he said, ripples can become waves. Lex crouched at the fountain's edge, voice low, and he said, waves crash and vanish. Jonah stood behind them, firm, and he said, but the tide always returns. Evelyn approached from the shadows with perfect grace, and she said, the tide bends to the moon, and I am the moon. Maya met her gaze without flinching, and she said, then tonight the tide turns against you. Lightning lit the fountain like fire in the rain. The storm thinned to a steady drizzle as Maya unfolded Rose's final page, and she wrote, if they silence me, let them remember my echo. Daniel's voice trembled, and he said, echoes don't fade when carried in love. Lex's jaw tightened, and he said, I'll carry it in rage if I must. Jonah's voice steadied like stone, and he said, carry it in truth, not rage. Evelyn stood nearby, her expression unreadable, and she said, echoes are only air if no one listens. Maya's voice grew stronger, and she said, then I will never stop listening. The drizzle tapped like a clock, counting down. The city street was nearly empty, the storm leaving only echoes of its rage. Maya looked across the skyline and she said, Rose deserved more than silence. Daniel tucked his coat around her shoulders and he said, and you gave her more than silence, you gave her fight. Lex scowled toward the courthouse glow, and he said, but the fight feels stolen. Jonah rested a steadying hand on his arm, and he said, the fight isn't over. It never is. Evelyn watched them like a queen unshaken, and she said, every fight becomes history, and history bends toward those who write it. Maya's eyes sharpened, and she said, then I will write it in her name. The wind carried her vow through the rain-drenched street. At the edge of the street, Maya paused under a single flickering lamp. She said, justice failed, but truth breathes. Daniel's voice was low, and he said, breathing truth keeps memory alive. Lex's restless energy softened and he said, then her ghost is with us still. Jonah's tone grounded them and he said, ghosts are guides when we let them be. Evelyn turned into shadow, her voice fading, and she said, truth is fragile, and so are those who chase it. Maya lifted Rose's page high, and she said, then let fragility echo louder than lies. The lamp flickered once more before going out, leaving only the storm's hush.